Okay, so our next speaker is waiting in the wings. Now, our next session, Plans Don't Survive First Contact, what the military teaches us about cyber incidents, explores the moment every cyber team knows too well, when an incident breaks and the reality looks nothing like the plan. Drawing from military principles, this session examines how uncertainty, friction, and incomplete information shape real-world response, and why the best teams succeed not by sticking rigidly to a script, but by adapting faster than the situation deteriorates. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome our next speaker to the stage, Craig McEwen, Global CISO for Dechra.
Good afternoon, everyone. Craig McEwen, Chief Information Security Officer at Dechra, an animal pharmaceutical company. It's lovely to see you all today. I'm going to start with an apology. This was supposed to be a 40-minute presentation. It's been condensed into 20 just to help things move along. So I'm going to try my very best to condense everything into these 20 minutes. Cyber and the military. So before going into cyber, I served in the British Army in various different roles and on various different deployments. And there's a lot of commonality between military operations and cyber operations. That first and foremost, cyber operations, much like the military, is long periods of boredom. Hopefully not like this presentation, but there is lots of routine, just doing stuff that happens day in, day out, and tends to bring in a lot of fatigue with your analysts. People get complacent, people get tired, sometimes people get bored, but then suddenly something happens. A cyber incident, or in the military, a contact, and all your planning, and more importantly, your routine, goes out the window. Now, unfortunately, this picture was taken by a press photographer when we got into contact. It's not as action-orientated as I wanted, but it's the best I could do. And so, when people get disrupted, when you go from that routine into something that isn't routine, it causes huge problems. Now, in the military, we train day in, day out to prepare for those situations. It's a little bit different in the private and public sectors, though. And it causes a lot of problems when organizations face a cyber incident or a cyber attack. Often, our planning is too rigid. Incidents never follow the same pathway. They do not adhere to that tabletop exercise that you've done 6 months ago. Incidents are fluid, they change. And if your plans are too rigid, it's difficult for your teams to adapt to what's happening. And this comes down to leadership that we'll talk about a little bit later on. A lot of the time our plans are either too technical, they are 200 pages of what to do in a ransomware attack, what to do in an impersonation attack, or they're too vague, they're 1 page of basically nothing. A lot of the planning also tends to be owned by IT. If we consider cyber as part of the IT wider organization, our plans tend to be focused on how we restore IT systems, but really it's about how do we restore the business and preserve business continuity. And so sometimes we focus on the wrong side of incident response. Rehearsals tend to be limited. I would ask for a show of hands, but I suspect I'll know the answer. How many people have done a full crisis simulation with your entire board and have done it frequently, at least on an annual basis? There aren't many organizations that can claim to have done that, and yet it's so important. And then we tend to plan our incidents based on compliance, ticking those boxes and making sure that the auditors are happy. We don't actually do it for the actual real situation. So, when plans don't survive first contact, what do we do? Well, it creates a lot of shock. You know, if you've ever been in a cyber incident, everybody will have had that gut feeling when you're ripped out of your, usually a Friday or Saturday night rest, and thrust into something that's trying to harm the business that ultimately pays you your team's salaries. So there's a lot of shock. There's also uncertainty. You've gone from very predictable routine stuff to something that isn't routine. And so there's a huge degree of uncertainty. And that is what tends to cause plans to collapse. And so what I want to talk about today is what in the military they call the combat estimate, also known as 7 questions. And it's a framework that we use in the military, which I found very beneficial in my career as a CISO to help me prepare for incidents, both before the incidents and during the actual incident themselves. So the benefits of the combat estimate of the 7 questions is it's a flexible process. So it's not a rigid process that explicitly tells you what to do. It's a framework that allows flexibility, and it's stepped to a thing that we call sort of action-centered leadership and mission command. It's the idea that we define the outcomes, but we allow the stages to those outcomes to be fluid and dynamic and to change in response to what's going on at that point in time. It gives a degree of clarity. So as humans, we do like to have a little bit of clarity, a set of guide rails. So it does provide that. And it focuses more on effects, outcomes, rather than specific tasks. And that's really important. So if we go to the first question, so of the 7-question process, there'll be no surprise, there are 7 questions. The first one is, and in my mind the most important, is what is the situation and how does it affect me? Now, I remember one of my first cyber roles working in a telco in the UK, a global telco, and we had a hands-on keyboard attack. And we spent the first 24 hours trying to map the network of where these impacted endpoints were and what they connected to. We weren't actually doing anything other than basic architectural diagrams. And that's not a great place to be if you're facing an incident. You need to be taking actions to contain, to understand, and ultimately to eradicate and recover. But we were completely bogged down in this need to just understand where in the network these devices were. So understanding how things work is really important. And that ties into a CMDB. You know, having a CMDB is so important. It's accurate and it's effective. And if you consider some cyber incidents, for example, let's say Norsk Hydro, Equifax, where one single server that wasn't on the CMDB was impacted, and that caused massive data loss. So understanding your network and understanding your devices is so important. Also understanding what's critical to your business is also so important. If you consider some other breaches that we've seen in the past, for example, Maersk, where they lost all the domain controllers but one, a Ghanaian domain controller that was offline at the time of the initial attack. That suddenly became their critical asset. So understanding what the situation is, as in what is your business, what makes up your business from a networking perspective, from an endpoint, from a server perspective, is so important. And then understanding when an attack happens, how that relates to the rest of your network, will give you the ability to start to make decisions quickly, unlike the telco example that I gave you. But when we look at question 2, we talk about what have I been told to do and why. And this really focuses on understanding what your role is in the event of a cyber incident. As an organization, as a cybersecurity function, what do you have to do? And that helps provide clarity when you're trying to understand your plans and what you're going to tackle first. One of the first things is, what must we protect? Now, often cyber teams are smaller than we'd like them to be. We don't always get the budget that we want. And incident response is never going to give you thousands of people to help. So understanding the criticality of devices, understanding what's important to protect. If you take that Maersk example, it wasn't the 45,000 endpoints that was important in terms of incident remediation. It was validating, protecting, and then utilizing that single domain controller to try and then recover their Active Directory. So rather than trying to clean out all 45,000 endpoints, that's where the focus needed to be. So understanding during the incident what's important, because we cannot fix everything at once. It might be Active Directory, it might be something different, but that becomes super important. And that ties into what outcomes matter most. And we'll go into that a bit later when we talk about sort of minimum viable company, which brings into question 3. What effects do I need to achieve? So this really leads on from question 2, and it's, what do I need to do? Do I need to contain the attacker movement? Do I need to bring up Active Directory first? It's interesting. I'd done a disaster recovery planning exercise at a mine site, and we defined what we call a minimum viable company. And that's the minimum things we require for that mine site to produce its goods. It's not pretty. You wouldn't want to work that way forever. You might be doing manual paperwork-based processing, that type of thing. But it's enough for the company to survive and to continue whilst you fix everything else. And when we looked at that minimum viable company beforehand, I would have said, my most important asset is my Active Directory. If I lose that, I lose everything. Actually, what we discovered was it was a clock-in system. The other systems where you have a card and you clock in to say that you're on shift, you clock out to say you finished your work. Our miners relied on that to validate that they'd worked. And it became very clear to us that if we didn't have the ability to clock in, people wouldn't come to work because they wouldn't trust that they'd be paid. You know, they live typically in poorer communities, and there isn't always that trust relationship that you maybe have in a corporate office. So we came to the conclusion that actually the first thing we need to get back up and running is a clock-in system. If we don't do that, it doesn't matter if AD's up, workers aren't going to come in and do mining stuff. So that minimum viable company becomes really important. The biggest thing, though, to take away from this is it's focusing on outcomes and not tasks. And the same mining company, we had an issue in Botswana where they had a hands-on-keyboard attack on one of our virtual machines. And I had a policy for this exact type of event. And it was very straightforward. If you see an attack on the virtual machine, as we alert you to it, take a snapshot, shut it down, and then leave it. The team panicked and they erased the VM straight away. Now that stopped the attack, so you could say that's not problematic, but it then denied any ability for us to forensically investigate what was going on. And that would come back to haunt us in a later stage because it's actually a sophisticated low and slow attack, of which that was the golden nugget of information, had we had it, would have highlighted everything else that was going on. But the team didn't understand the outcome. I'd given them the task, take a snapshot and to shut the machine down. They didn't understand why I wanted that to happen. They didn't understand the outcome was to preserve evidence to allow us to forensically exploit and try and understand the root cause of the attack. So in doing what they'd done, they thought they were protecting the business. I hadn't, in my duty, made them understand what the outcome was, what I was trying to do. So that becomes really important, and a lot of this is about outcomes and not tasks. When we talk about question 4, we talk about how do we best achieve these effects. And that sounds a bit tenuous from a cyber perspective, but really it comes down to a few things. For me, it's about segmentation. It's where do we focus our efforts? If you think back to Maersk again, their focus was that domain controller. That's where their efforts needed to be. If you had a finite team of engineers, that's where you needed to put them, to focus on validating that that was a clean copy, and then preparing that to then help you rebuild the rest of your domain controllers globally. If you think from a military perspective, the best place to achieve an effect is in a bottleneck, where you restrict the movement of enemy troops. And if you're a movie fan, you'll recognize 300, and they're a good example of that. 300 Spartans positioned themselves in a bottleneck, which allowed them to defend against vastly superior numbers. It's why, in terms of preparing for instance, micro-segmentation becomes really important. If you can segment things down, and you can become clinical about what's important and what's not important, you can then start to cut bits of the network off quite freely if you see an attack. You know what bits of the network you need to bring back online first before you bring everything back online. So understanding how your network is segmented, improving that segmentation, will give you the ability to look at where you can best achieve your efforts. Again, we don't have an infinite resource of people when it comes to an incident, so being explicit and specific about where we focus our efforts will help you recover more quickly in the long run. Question 5 is fairly obvious. What resources do I need in the event of an incident? And the usual answer I get if I was to ask the audience is more resources. In the absence of more resources, it's being absolutely clear to yourself in your planning and to the board when you're seeking your budget what you actually need to give you a fighting chance in an incident. Do you have IR retainers? Do you have the ability to call in professional organizations to support you during an incident? Do you have SMEs? Do you have an AD SME? Do you have an SME who's responsible for domain controllers? Or did you outsource that and then get rid of that outsourced partner 2 years ago? understanding where you'll have pressure points and where you will need people and processes to support you becomes really, really important. And that goes to internal functions as well. So do you need legal? Do you need corporate comms? The answer is probably yes to both, but when do you need them? And how do you need them? And define ways that you work together. Define privacy. And we'll come on to that actually in question 7. Question 6, when we talk about when and where do the actions occur, this is about sequencing our steps. So a high-level way of looking at it is to contain, to communicate, to eradicate, and to recover. There's actually a lot more to it than that. You may choose not to contain immediately. You may be comfortable in your cyber capabilities, and in the event of an attack, you may actually want it to play out to try and understand what the attack is trying to achieve. Now that's fairly advanced. For most organizations, that will probably go above your board's risk threshold, or you just won't have the maturity to be confident that you can track and cut it off when you get to that point. But if you are in that position, you may want to do that. And if we go back a few questions, understanding the outcome rather than the task of allowing the attacker to continue their attack becomes really important. Why are we doing that? Why are we comfortable allowing this to happen? You will get to containment eventually, and the question there is, do you soft contain? Do you just restrict from the network? Or do you do what they've done in Botswana? Do you just completely eradicate virtual machines? Just completely nuclear option, reset them effectively? You need to be clear on what you're going to do there. Communications becomes important as well, both internally to your teams and externally. Do you need to communicate to those outside? If you're a publicly traded company, the answer is probably yes. So how do you do that? And more importantly, who does that? There's often a topical one on the board. Is it the CISO? Is it the CIO if you report into an IT function? Is it the CEO? Is it the head of corporate comms? Lots of people like to communicate, but who's the right person to do it? And the other parts are fairly straightforward, communicating, eradicating, recovering. But it's good to have clarity of the actions. Again, not explaining how to do them, so not task-orientated, but outcome-orientated, to give the teams the freedom to change under the banners of those outcomes. And then finally, and there's one other one I want to talk about, but this is the final proper bit of question 7. In the military, it's what control measures should I impose? In our sort of language, in a cyber sense, it's who has the decision-making authorities to do things. The most obvious one, if you're in manufacturing or production, and you have operational technology, who has the authority to shut down a site or to take a network segment offline? This has safety implications. It also has production implications. And if you're a manufacturing company, that ultimately has bottom line implications. Does the CISO have the ability to shut down a site? Does the CISO have to go and seek permission from whoever they report into or from the CEO? That needs to be well understood. Again, it's not defining the task, but it's defining the outcome. And if you don't understand that, you'll waste more time in instant response calls working out who's going to make that decision. And if it's not clear, sometimes nobody will make the decision. So having these conversations ahead of time becomes super, super important. You need to also set containment boundaries, and this again comes down to that micro-segmentation side of things. Preserving evidence, who's responsible for that, and making sure that teams understand why we're preserving forensic evidence. Reference the Botswana issue I had before. But there's a whole host of things where you need to define who has the authority to make the decisions. And if you have them clearly defined, then the business knows what to expect. So if I do shut down a factory, the business knows that that was my decision, and it was happy with that, and therefore it trusts that I made the right decision. And if I get it wrong, the business knows who to blame. So it works really well. So I don't have enough time to go through these slides, because as I said, this meant to be 40 minutes. The big thing I want to impart, though, is from an incident preparedness perspective, 7 questions is really useful. It's helped me in a lot of incidents as I've gone along my career. The biggest thing, though, and where the 7 questions will not work, is that idea of mission commands, that leadership principle where I give you the outcome, the objective, and I don't tell you how to achieve it. I leave you with the freedom to go and figure that out yourself. If you come to me and you're unsure, of course I'll help you. I'll lean in as an expert and I'll give you my advice. But broadly, I'm going to leave you to figure out how to do it. It's important in normal operations to give your teams that freedom. It gives them empowerment and it keeps them engaged. It's essential when it comes to incident response, because if I want somebody to do something, I can't tell them how to do it step by step, because the incident would be far too fluid for that to be successful. I need to trust them, and they need to know that they are trusted, that they're free to make the decision themselves, as long as they have the outcome in mind. And if they get it wrong, as long as it's not through negligence, then that's just the nature of the game. We all make mistakes, especially when it comes to incident response. And so the final message, because it is time to wrap up, plans don't survive first contact. Don't make 200-page incident response plans. Nobody will read them, and if they do, they won't remember a thing. But plans do survive first contact. So the 7 questions for me is a planning tool. It's a tool that allows me to plan for those worst case situations. Use it to bring clarity to your response plans, structure, because we do need those handrails, even though we give freedom to operate within the handrails. It helps give calm because the business knows what to expect, so it's not a surprise. And it gives you confidence that you have something when it all goes wrong. So rehearse it, embed it into your culture and into your DNA, and then trust it. When the day of the races comes and you're faced with an incident, trust that this framework will be your friend. And I don't think I have any time for questions, so I'm going to stop there and thank you very much for your attention.